So let's look at how the headset comes apart. This particular bike I've already taken the handlebars off of, and you'll notice this is not the regular screw that goes in this headset. This was a replacement. The original screw is going to have a slightly smaller hex head on it. This is one of the weirdest parts on the old Schwinn bikes. If you ever strip out the handlebar screw, you will find it is very difficult to find a replacement for that. Try a 5/8. 5/8 will get it. The apparently going way back in history when Schwinn first started building bikes, although they were an American company and made bikes in Chicago, some of the parts actually came from British bikes, or at least some of the specifications. And this screw, trying to remember what the threads are on this. Let's see if we can find the protractor that's lost. This is apparently a 3/8 inch thread, a 3/8 inch screw, and I think it's a 32 pitch. You will not find this in American hardware stores. I had to actually search, and I found a company that sells British sports car parts that carried this particular thread. I think it's a 3/8 inch British fine thread. Look for that in the text in the video or down in the description. But that aside, this is a quill type fork. Handlebar stem goes down inside the fork, and there's a little wedge, and I'm going to have to see how tight this is here. This is a very long bolt with a nut down on the bottom end. That nut engages a little slug of metal that's tapered. And you can see this is actually broken. This is a pretty old, funky handlebar stem. What happens is when the screw pulls this upward, it expands down inside of this tube. So it actually, you put it down in here, it expands inside that tube, and that's how it grips. So a lot of times this will be really stuck, and when you loosen this screw, you might get it up like this, but you can't get it to go down because the wedge is so stuck. That's when you put a piece of wood on here and then strike it with a hammer, or use a rubber mallet to strike that screw. When you strike that screw, it will free that little wedge at the bottom, and then you should be able to pull this thing out. So we take out the stem. While the crank had a 32 millimeter, the headset on this bike has a 30 millimeter nut. And I don't recall how tight this one's going to be. I'm just going to lean into it a little bit. I need a little more leverage. Lefty loosey. Oh, God. So, got her loose. Now it's going to come off with the hands. So we got our top nut. We can see how rusty this old thing is. There's our little, again, keyed washer. That little tab fits into a groove on the steer tube. Then we got another threaded piece, big nut, that serves as the bearing race. Ooh. Put a little oil on that. I hate running threads against rust when they squeak like that. We just put a little teeny tiny bit of oil in there. And now it's going to still grind a little bit. But we get our head nut off here. You can see the bearings coming out behind it a little bit. This serves as our upper bearing race. Note the way the bearings come out. This is sort of a cup that fits on the outside of the bearings. This is a cone that fits inside the bearings. When you crank this down, it just tightens down on those bearings. Our steering tube comes out. This top race is friction fit. This bottom cup is friction fit. You don't want to knock these out unless you really have to. Then again, note the way our bearings come out. The closed outer side goes down against the cone. The exposed outside goes up into the cup. Again, I didn't expect that lower race to come off that easy. Usually those are friction fit quite tight. But now I know if I ever need a lower race, I got a fork where one will come off real easy. That means I can also scam this little chrome crown off of this fork. I'm not going to do it right now, but I love to put these little chrome crowns on my bikes. If I got a fork that doesn't have one, this one might get sacrificed for that purpose. So let's see, this goes down. I'll put my other bearings on here. And after I disassemble a fork from the frame, I always like to screw all the parts back together. You're not going to lose them as easily this way. Put your tabbed washer back on with the tab lined up with the slot. That again serves to hold that washer still so that when you tighten this down, it doesn't further tighten the other nut. Now I'm going to crank these down a little bit further. So whenever I remove a fork, if I'm not putting the fork right back on a bike, I always put the bearings and all the parts on there for safe storage. God knows I lose plenty of stuff without losing all these little parts. So these bearings are going to get the same treatment. These bearings are going to get the same treatment as the crank bearings. They're going to soak in some degreaser. They're going to get scrubbed. These bearing races are going to get scrubbed. Then this will all go back together if I reuse this frame. So of course the bearing races here are going to need to be cleaned up just like the bearings and the removable parts. And then the bottom bracket, it's got old nasty grease caked in it just like the bearings did. I'm going to have to spray some degreaser in here and clean that very aggressively just like I'm doing with the bearings. Just some details on this particular frame. This frame was a Schwinn Racer. I think this is about a 68. It's got somebody's bicycle license from 1969 on it. These older 3-speeds had not only cable guides on the frame, but they had a little plastic wheel here. And what we had was the shifting cable for the Sturmey Archer hub came through here, and then it went through a wheel, and then you know, the cable went down from the wheel and back into a cable housing. Most of the frames from this era had a threaded tab for the back of the chain guard. They had a welded on tab here with just a hole, no threads, for the front of the chain guard. The dropouts on these bikes were almost all horizontal or practically horizontal. There was typically a fender rack and accessories tab. The 10 speeds didn't have a derailleur hanger. The derailleurs typically came with their own little hanger, and the rear axle went through that hanger. So you didn't have a derailleur hanger. And all of the Schwinn bikes from this period, of course, had the built-in welded on kickstand assembly. What else? Typical Schwinn head badge is in pretty beat up condition. This is the original seat clamp, but the nut and bolt have been taken out of it, and a quick release has been put in there to replace it, so you could crank that bad boy down tight. The seat tube on these is skinnier than newer bikes, and the seat post is skinnier than newer bikes. It has a skinnier head on it. If you want to put a modern seat on these bikes, you have to buy a seat tube that fits this skinny tube here, and then has a wider head on it instead of the narrow head. Okay, that's enough for this one.